Good morning. This is Josh, and we're getting started on the book of Genesis. And I wanted to use the NIV Bible commentary and abridgment of the Gold Medallion winning Expositor's Bible Commentary, Volume 1, the Old Testament. Kenneth L. Barker and John Kohlenberger III are consulting editors. All right, so we're looking at the book of Genesis. An introduction. Background. Little is known about the origin and authorship of the book of Genesis. It is part of the Pentateuch, which Jewish tradition and the New Testament have ascribed to Moses. John 1:17, John 5:46, John 7:19, and verse 23 attest to this. Generally, the question of the authorship of Genesis is taken up within the context of theories regarding the literary history of the Pentateuch as a whole. We must distinguish at least two kinds of background material in the book of Genesis. One, the historical background in which the book was written, and two, the historical background of the context of the events recorded in the book. The first concerns a specific time and place for the composition of the book. The second covers a wide-ranging array of settings, for example, the Garden of Eden, the flood, the city of Babylon, Canaan, and Egypt. Genesis records two types of events, those that happened on a global or even cosmic scale, for example, creation, the flood, and those that happened in a relatively isolated, localized way, Noah's drunkenness, Abraham's vision. By far, most events in Genesis happened in a limited sphere of time and location and can best be described as family matters. 2. The unity of the book. The book of Genesis is characterized by both an easily discernible unity and a noticeable lack of uniformity, much like the writers of the New Testament Gospels and the latter historical books of the Old Testament. The writer of Genesis appears to have composed his work from archival records of God's great deeds in the past. We know from references within the early historical books that such records were maintained at an early stage in Israel's history. Exodus 17:14, Numbers 21:14, and Joshua 10:13 are good examples. So perhaps similar records were kept at far earlier stages within the individual households of the patriarchs and their tribal ancestors. The narratives within Genesis appear to be largely made up of small, self-contained stories worked together into larger units by means of various geographical and genealogical tables. Thus, one should not expect to find absolute uniformity of style, vocabulary, etc. among all the individual narratives, any more than an absolute uniformity can be expected in the latter historical books. Indeed, we would more likely expect the writer, working under the direction of God, to have preserved his record just as he had received them, sacrificing uniformity for the sake of historical faithfulness. The authorship. The question naturally arises as to who wrote or composed the final account of the book of Genesis. Who put all the narratives together? The composer of Genesis, which is part of the Pentateuch. So the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, by the way. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Who put all the narratives together? The composer of Genesis, which is part of the Pentateuch, seems most likely to be the same as that of the Pentateuch as a whole. Nowhere in the work does the author refer to himself or identify himself. Early and reliable tradition has ascribed the authorship to Moses, and it is a fact that throughout the Pentateuchal narrative, it is Moses who is most closely associated with the writing of the material contained in the Pentateuch. For example, see Exodus 17:14, 20 verse 1, also Joshua 8:31 through 32. It appears certain that Jesus and the writers in the New Testament believed that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch. See John 5 verse 46. The purpose of Genesis. Since the purpose of the book of Genesis is intricately bound up with the purpose of the Pentateuch, we shall address briefly the question of the overall purpose of the Pentateuch. The task of discovering the purpose of a work that is so large and diverse is best achieved by means of compositional analysis, which basically describes the method and techniques used by an author. The final shaping of the canonical Pentateuch involved the sorting and placement of material, consisting of at least 4 distinct literary types: narrative, poetry, law, and genealogy. The genealogical texts play an important role in the early sections of the Pentateuch, especially in the book of Genesis, but do not lead to fruitful conclusions about the shape or structure of the Pentateuch as a whole. A similar verdict can be drawn from a consideration of the large legal collections within the Pentateuch. The importance of such collections is beyond dispute, but they do not appear to be the means by which the whole of the Pentateuch has been shaped. A close study of the author's use of narrative and poetic texts, however, sheds considerable light on the final shape of the work. The technique of using a poetic speech and a short epilogue to conclude a narrative is well known in biblical literature and occurs frequently within recognizable segments of the Pentateuch itself. The creation account in Genesis 1 and 2 concludes with the short poetic discourse of Adam, 2 verse 23, followed by an epilogue, verse 24. The account of the fall in chapter 3 concludes with a poetic discourse, verses 14 through 19, and an epilogue, verses 20 through 24. The account of Cain in chapter 4 concludes with a poetic discourse, verses 23 through 24, and an epilogue, verse 25 through 26. That this same pattern can be found throughout Genesis suggests that it was an important part of the compositional technique of the author. Most notable is the occurrence of this pattern in the Joseph story, chapters 37 through 48, which concludes with the poetic discourse of Jacob's blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, 48:15 through 16 and verse 20. More importantly, however, the poetic speech short epilogue pattern reoccurs at a much higher level within the entire Pentateuch, suggesting that the technique was extended as part of the structure embracing the whole of the 5-volume work. Another literary theme in the Pentateuch can be expressed by the term narrative typology. Narrative typology. One cannot read the Pentateuch without recognizing definite similarities among narratives. Genesis 12, verse 10 through 20, and Genesis 20, 1 through 18, and 26, 1 through 11. It is even possible that the sojourn of Abraham in Egypt and later in Gerar, both because of a famine, and Isaac's sojourn in Gerar, also because of a famine, foreshadowed Genesis 41 through Exodus 12. Israel's sojourn in Egypt that came about as a result of the famine recorded in the Joseph story. What the author wants to show is that the events of the past are pointers to those in the future. Literary form. Except for scattered poetic sections in Genesis, its overall literary form is historical narrative, which is the representation of past events for the purpose of instruction. Two dimensions are always at work in shaping such narratives: the course of the historical event itself, and the viewpoint of the author who recounts the events. Thus, we must not only look at the course of the event in its historical setting, but we must also look for the purpose and intention of the author in recounting the event. No historical narrative is a complete account of all that occurred in a given event or series of events. The author must select those events that most effectively relate not only what happened, but also the meaning and significance of what happened. A close study of Genesis 1:1-2-4a shows that the author made a careful and purposeful selection in the composition of the creation account. Rather than give detail about the creation of the angels, stars, and galaxies, the author has chosen to concentrate on the creation and preparation of the land. In fact, he has only 3 specific subjects in his account of creation: God, man, and woman, and land. Although the creation of the sun and the moon is given considerable attention, neither of these bodies is mentioned in its own right, but only as it relates to the affairs of humans on earth. Chapter 1:14-15. What then does Genesis 1:1 through chapter 2:4a tell us about the land? It tells us that God is its owner. He created and prepared the land, and he can give it to whomever he chooses. Jeremiah 27:5. Another interrelationship between structure and selection, the Genesis 1:1-2-4a shows, is in the view of God. He is the creator of the universe. Because Israel came to know God in a close and personal way, a certain theological pressure existed that tended to localize and nationalize God as the God of Israel alone. Micah 3:11, for example. Over against this lesser view of God stands the message of Genesis 1, with its clear introduction to the God who created the universe and who has blessed all humanity. From the point of view of the author of the Pentateuch, the creator of the universe has a plan of blessing for all people. This, the theological foundation of all subsequent missionary statements in the Bible. Finally, Genesis 1:1-2-4a serves as a backdrop for the central theme of the Pentateuch. The most prominent event and the most far-reaching theme in the Pentateuch is the covenant between God and Israel, established at Mount Sinai. That covenant relates directly back to God's initial desire to bless the human race. About that theme we can say 3 things. 1, the covenant at Sinai was God's plan to restore his blessing to the human race through the descendants of Abraham. Genesis 12:1-3, Exodus 2:24. Number 2, however, the covenant at Sinai failed to restore that blessing because Israel failed to trust God and obey his will. Number 3, but the author goes on to demonstrate that God's promise to restore the blessing will ultimately succeed because God himself promised to give Israel, at some future date, a heart that would trust and obey him. Deuteronomy 30:1-10. In other words, the entire outlook of the Pentateuch is eschatological, for it looks to the future as the time when God's faithful promise blessing would be fulfilled. To summarize, therefore, Genesis 1:1-2-4a, the author of the Pentateuch tends It intends his creation account to relate to his readers that God, the creator of the universe, has prepared the land as a home for his special creature, the human race, and that he has a plan of blessing for all of his creatures.